Welcome to Neon Cobra. Let's kick into it. We're going to have a small change of format today. I'm going to start a new series, I think, with some of the experience that I have for project management. So specifically, we're going to talk about kind of the project lifecycle for an Azure deployment. Now, a lot of this might be usable on other projects, but the specific focus in certain areas we are going to highlight are going to be items that you may run into. Now, we're going to follow a little bit of the PMP methodology, and I will caveat this is methodology that I did maybe about 6 years ago. Shouldn't have changed too much, but we're going to focus on 5 main areas. We're going to look at scoping, planning, execution, the audit phase, and closure. They're all very important and unique. Now, the projects themselves aren't going to really rigidly follow the PMP methodology. I use those as high-level containers. The reality is in an MSP space, you're going to be moving very, very quick on these items, and a lot of these will blur. But I think it's important to kind of isolate and identify these independently to understand that why they need to be done and the advantages of doing so and some of the risks missing it. So as far as one of the major changes, instead of counting down 2 minutes, we're going to count up because I still want to keep track of items. And this will probably be accompanied with more in-depth written portion at a later date. I want to make sure that the content itself is relevant. It's not just, a ChatGPT spit out of like PMP methodologies. So we're going to try to build a little bit around this, and it might turn into a little ebook at a later date. So with that in mind, let's kick off. So we're going to talk about scoping. Now, this is really going to be your pre-sales and architecture phase. And there are really 2 halves of this coin. There's the one half where you don't do enough of it and you ended up getting a tremendous amount of scope creep or just a really poorly provisioned or undersold project. And on the other side, you spend so much time assessing the environment, you lose the sale, right? So you need to find a middle ground to gather enough valuable information and be able to design and pad enough of a project to ensure that you are not hemorrhaging money. Now, the interesting factor that you'll run into oftentimes is a lot of these projects are being sold to clients of yours that already have a service agreement in play. So there's this thought of, anything that doesn't get covered in the labor will roll into your service agreement. And I would argue that you don't want to do that. While yes, you can, balance it over, then you don't have really a good idea or understanding of how much your projects need to be charging for. Because then if you have a similar scoped project go out to a non-MSA client, you're going to lose that money. So you want to make sure your lines of delineation between project and service are very clear. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in the planning phase. When we're talking about moving an environment from on-prem into Azure, there's a couple of items you're going to want to assess and ensure you have in your quiver. You want to, first off, know the quantity of servers, right? You want a full assessment, at least to understand what the servers are, the resources, the storage space being used, both free and used, and the purpose. Because oftentimes we'll find a ridiculous amount of storage and we'll scope that into Azure to find out that's just some sort of legacy backup or archive project that doesn't need to be taken up anymore. And that's the second thing. You want to know your data sizes, right? The biggest factor in Azure spending and cost a lot of time is just doing no refactoring and taking a 1-for-1 environment from on-premise into the cloud. Because your physical drives on-premise were CapEx expense, as in you bought them 5, 6, 7 years ago, you just have a tendency to hoard data. So sometimes you have 6, 7, 8 copies. You've got profiles from 5 years ago that don't matter anymore. You'll have things like line of business applications that aren't being used anymore, but they're just never uninstalled. And then you try to take all that data up and then use it. So you really need to understand how much data is being used, how big the drives are, and what the data is, and do you need to refactor that? Oftentimes with these projects, especially if you're going to do a virtual desktoping move, you're probably going to want to move a lot of that data into SharePoint, the collaboration stuff. Not a full file share, mind you, right? Be very clear about that. But collaborative files and things like that may be accessed regularly, Word docs. SharePoint Online makes a great candidate for this stuff and can help free up some of the workspace. And then second on that is we want to make sure how many users, right? When we're determining how many users are in the environment, that's really to determine 2 things, really. How big your domain controller should be, if you still need a domain controller, which we'll talk about that. And then the line of business applications you're bringing up, are they accessible over VPN, or do you need virtual desktoping? Or are you tending just to move them to a full OpEx model and use virtual desktoping? So the quantity of active users and what they do in the environment is very important for that. Now, during your initial discovery and scoping phases, it doesn't really matter if you don't understand immediately everyone's role and responsibility. But an active AD list is very, very important, right? It also helps kind of identify maybe some stale records and some security vulnerabilities for non-deactivated accounts. So having that information is very important. So we've assessed the environment. We know how many users. We know the line of business applications. The next thing you really need to determine is how do you connect to this environment, right? There's a very good chance for the last 15, 20 years, everyone's been working in office. And there are certain line of business apps that do not function over the internet, even with a VPN. There are certain accounting packages that while they do work, they're not supported by the vendor. And if you lift them into Azure, you put them on a VPN, and then you find out, hey, guess what? It doesn't work. And then the line of business vendor will not support you anymore because it's an unsupported configuration. So with this in mind, you need to understand the line of business. You need to understand whether it works over VPN. And that's a very easy test, right? You can always just test. Likely they have a firewall of some sort. Likely you already know the line of business application if you've been doing it enough. So then that's where you determine workload, the amount of users, and whether they will be in AVD or not. Or is there a cloud option, right? Maybe you sign them up for the cloud version and shut that entire server down. Second to this is how do you secure the environment, right? If there are certain line of business applications that maybe, have a web interface that was internal this whole time over port 80 and, you didn't really care too much, it wasn't internet facing. Well, the second you put that into Azure, you have to make some decisions, right? Are you going to keep it open to port 80? Don't, right? You may wrap a VPN around it, but then it becomes a little bit more difficult, right? So you got to figure out how people are going to access this app and, whether it'll function or not. All of these items really kind of factor in to your overall cost and labor. And actually another item for that is you're already, doing remote desktop services or virtual desktoping, right? Well, we'll see oftentimes is, first jump into Azure, you kind of want to just keep things and treat it like a hypervisor. So you will lift your remote desktop services up. The difficulty with a lot of this, though, is the licensing, right? All your on-premise licensing, unless with active software assurance, becomes invalidated. So you're now moving environments up into Azure and you're doubling your licensing costs and paying for a bunch of additional hardware resources because RDS isn't really optimized compared to AVD. So when we're talking about this, part of your scoping should be, are we just shifting and lifting? Are we rescoping? Are we redesigning? Are we building a brand new domain? Are we moving the domain up? So these are items that you kind of need to scope for and understand. So understanding the user environment, how they function, what they do, will really determine the scoping phase. Now, the end goal of this is to have a proposal for your sales team go and win the deal. So you're trying to navigate that, not making it too expensive and providing enough value. But on the same time, you need to be true to yourself, right? Don't cut corners. Don't take money out of your MSA agreement to pay for your projects. Yes, there'll be somebody out there that maybe will scope things a little bit lower, will beat you on price, but that's why we need to value sell. And this is going to be no different than if you were selling physical hardware versus a shift into Azure versus a shift into your own data center, right? For everything you miss and you don't scope correctly, or you try to do a favor for the client to win them, you're essentially just paying out of your pocket down the road, right? You're writing checks that you may not be able to cash, and then you start increasing your service level margins as opposed to making profit on it. And this is also often the surprise we see even with the on-premise, when we have organizations say, like, I can't give up the on-premise capital boost that I expect every 5 years. If you really peel back the layers on the onion, if the project wasn't scoped correctly, you didn't make any money. You just essentially shifted money from an MSA agreement into a project agreement and then went and spent it, right? So we just need to be very careful when we're doing this. Be realistic, be defined, right? Define your scoped project as much as possible, because scope creep and gold plating, which are two terms. Scope creep is essentially anything outside of the project suddenly works their way into project. And then gold plating is almost, and the scope creep is, we're doing projects that maybe we didn't define quite well. So, we're doing an Azure migration and, while you're in there, do you mind re-racking and cleaning up the networking and things like that? That would be creep, right? Gold plating is your team offering extra work. Well, while we're in there, why don't we re-rack this? Or, you know what? Your printer, it's been funky this whole time. Yeah, just have my project team look at that while we're working on it. No, you need to define your project. You need to keep it clear. And it can be difficult because we like to help people, right? But be realistic. Don't take it on in the project because that bloats your labor. And then you have no way to understand what you've done. right? Did we scope it correctly? Did we make enough money? Did we sell it at the right level? So that's very important. Send it into service, right? Have them submit a service ticket. Even if that service ticket comes back to the on-premise technician, that's fine. But then what that does is it separates your labor buckets. Now, this becomes more important as you grow as an organization, but for smaller organizations, it's still a good habit to get into. So at the end of the scoping phase, we've assessed, we know what's in the environment, we know what's being used, we know where their line of business applications are going, we know how they're accessing it. And sometimes when we start doing these assessments, you realize you don't even need to move them. We can move them to Enter ID. We can move them to QuickBooks Online. We can shut everything down and go completely platformless. And then you've provided a much better environment. So proper scoping is important because sometimes it'll change the scope of the project in its entirety. So very important to do that. Now, the final thing I'll say, when you're designing these scopes of work for proposals and sale, always write in a clause for change management and change orders, right? Give yourself a little bit of wiggle room. Say price subject to change, plus minus, plus 10, minus 5, whatever the case is. For those unknowns of like there's a server in the closet. And, if you've been managing the environment, you probably have a pretty good understanding. But if you're going in blind, write clauses in. This price is on condition that there are no secrets. There are no major change requests in order. But reserve the right to do change management. Right? This prevents you from having to absorb unknown costs because you just didn't see something or the client didn't divulge something. And it's never generally malicious, but we need to be realistic with clients and set expectations, right? It's in the benefit for all parties to do this. If they want to make a change down the road where they're like, look, we don't want this line of business application, that's fine. A change order works in their favor. You change the scope of the project to refund some of the labor, right? Be realistic. So this is the first half. This is scoping. I knew it was going to be a little bit longer than 2 minutes at this point. Project management can be very, very difficult, especially if you're kind of flying, 6 or 7 projects at a time and running service. So I do have experience doing some of this stuff. So I want to make sure that a lot of this is kind of given over and there's slight variances in this compared to, say, an on-premise migration for a one-to-one. So we'll talk a little bit more about the planning phase. This is generally scope and design. Very, very important to get off on the right foot, but planning is really where things kind of hit the ground. So follow next week. You'll have more information on planning. We'll catch you next time.